Everybody needed to work during during World War II, that people couldn't spend their money that they needed to save because everything was being rationed, everything was going towards the war effort. Culturally, you should be aware of the role of women and the breakdown of families that had occurred as a result of World War II. We talked about the end of the war and America's involvement once again in the creation of a new world order. Just after World War I, the United States was instrumental in creating the League of Nations, which it did not join. After World War II, the United States was instrumental in creating the United Nations, which it did join, and has a permanent seat on the Security Council. You should be aware of why it was that the UN was not ever a particularly effective organization from its inception. It's because the Cold War had emerged early on. No sooner was the United States out of World War II, it had been allied with the Soviet Union in that war. Then it had learned much about the differences that existed between American ideology and that of the Soviet Union. You should be aware of the importance of George F. Kennan and his what was the long telegram, now published as an article called Sources of Soviet Conduct, in which he explains why the United States can't be friendly with the Soviet Union, explains some of the weaknesses of the Soviet Union, and introduces the strategy of containment, which becomes America's strategy throughout the Cold War. You should be able to explain how the strategy of containment was put into effect in the early days. Examples of this would be the Marshall Plan, or the airlifting of food into Berlin when there was a blockade to make sure that it didn't fall to the Soviet Union. You should be aware that the strategy of containment is also that which had led to the rise of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and to America's involvement in the Korean War in 1950. In the case of the Korean War, that's the first time that the strategy of containment was interpreted as a military strategy specifically, as opposed to something that was going to be economic support and more of a psychological warfare. If you have some knowledge of how the United States had fought the Korean War, that would be very helpful. It was a conventional war that became quite protracted because the United States did not have a clear goal of what it was that it was seeking to attain. Initially, it thought it was just to repel the North Vietnamese from the south, but continued to try to roll back the North, and China got involved. You should then have some knowledge of the cultural changes that existed in the 1950s. This was the age of the baby boom. This is something that contributed substantially to America's economic growth that happened between 1945 to 1960. That we have new technologies that are becoming widely available. Vaccines, such as the polio vaccine, antibiotics are widely available. Televisions are starting to come into their own. We have government spending as well on military, the hydrogen bomb, and the like also contributes to a time of prosperity for the U.S. And that this is a time of nesting. with the baby boom, which is bucking the long-standing trend of a decline in birth rates, which goes back to the very beginnings of industrialization. You should be aware as well that the rise of liberalism and the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, like the Korean War, was an instantiation of the doctrine of containment. That the United States had gotten into the Vietnam War incrementally. Its commitment to Vietnam dates back to 1950, right? Because it was spending money in Vietnam to try to support forces in the South. First it was the French, and then after the French had pulled out, the United States was supporting a leader named Diem. That it wasn't until Kennedy's administration that things in Vietnam became quite sour. After the assassination of Diem, that chaos had reigned. The United States had believed that Vietnam was in its vital interest because of a belief in the domino effect, that if it went, then all other areas of the Southeast would fall to communism. And also liberalism itself contributed to America committing to Vietnam because of this belief that all peoples in the world matter. You can't really make distinctions. Should be aware of the civil rights movement that came about in the 1960s. The civil rights movement was seeking to realize what the Supreme Court had tried to make into law was the end of segregation. The end of segregation legally came about because of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, but de facto still existed, and that's what gave rise to the civil rights movement. You'd be aware of Martin Luther King Jr., who is the leader of that movement. We had read his letter from a Birmingham jail and had talked about that and his rhetorical skills, so you should know something about that. You should be aware of some of the reasons why the civil rights movement came about when it did, and one of the reasons was the idealism of the youth at the time, these baby boomers. This belief in equality and crusades for social justice. And disillusionment challenging existing power and authority. You should be aware how the youth generation became increasingly militant throughout the 1960s, culminating in 1968 with widespread protests, which also coincided with the public perception of Vietnam changing into something that was a very unpopular war that would be difficult or if not impossible to win. And that brought about the end of Lyndon Baines Johnson. You should be aware about the rise of Nixon. He came into power after the election of 1968, promising an extrication from Vietnam, promising a return to law and order, and to clamp down on the more radical factions of society. You should be aware of the ways in which people became more disillusioned after his time as president. The Watergate scandal had contributed to that. The fact that America economically was faring poorly in the 1970s, and that had begun in large measure because of increases in oil prices. Also, the way that the war was being fought in Vietnam itself, where the United States was bombing the North Vietnamese just to get them to the negotiating table to get out, was another source of tremendous disillusionment. You should be aware of other crises of authority